and she will be giving a talk on the metaphysical explanation.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Nick, for inviting me. I feel a bit honored to be here among all these prominent grounding theorists where, sadly, I do not belong among them. So I will not be talking about grounding. Yes, I will, but I will be focusing on what I think is a very central aspect of grounding, but sadly neglected, I think, in the literature on grounding, namely the fact that grounding is supposed to be a kind of explanatory relation, because as I'll try to say a bit about, I think more could be said about that, but I think that perhaps the be or not to be of grounding, I think, will ultimately depend on how one understands the sense in which grounding is supposed to be explanatory. Because if it turns out that there is a way of being explanatory that is not captured by alternative relations of metaphysical dependence, then perhaps we do need a separate notion of grounding after all. Now, just a little bit of biographical background. So just about this time last year, I gave a talk called Metaphysical Explanation at the workshop in Barcelona. And it's more or less the same talk, actually, because that's when I was supposed to start working out the details of this, of my thoughts about metaphysical explanation. But then I had to go on sick leave, so I've just only recently come back. So unfortunately, if there is anyone who was there, I don't think Brian is here. No, he was supposed to come perhaps, and I'm glad he isn't, because it would be just like repetition of what I used to do. So, and then some preliminaries. First of all, I'll try to stay as neutral as possible when it comes to the question of whether there is one relation of grounding or if there are several groundings. I think that if my hypothesis turns out to be correct, which is that to be grounding in an interesting way, you will have to be metaphysically explanatory in an interesting way, then either there is only one such relation, or there are several of our more well-known metaphysical dependence relations that turn out to be explanatory in this sense, but I don't think all of them will turn out that way. And then I also would like to say that grounding, the way I'm going to approach the issue, is an old idea, so it didn't start with fine. And I think Jessica said something similar in No Work for a Theory of Grounding. I think I'm saying something slightly different from what she's saying. She's saying that there are lots of familiar relations, such as emergence or supervenience or type token identities and so on, that are also, or seem to work as grounding is supposed to work, at least more or less. And so that grounding has been around for a long time. Actually, I think grounding, the one relation, has been around for a long time. So I think, weirdly enough, people forget about people like David Armstrong and those guys, who I think have operated with the notion of grounding for a long time. Perhaps not well, like the details haven't been there, but I think the whole idea about some things being more fundamental than other things, some things making up other things, some things explaining other things, I think has been around for a very long time and made popular, especially by people like David Armstrong. I think we shouldn't forget about that. And also, for the purposes of this paper, I actually tend to believe it, is that I will assume that truth-making is a kind of grounding. And you may have conflicting ideas about that. I want to assume it here because many of my quotes will come from the truth-making literature, because actually, when you look at the grounding literature, there's precious little said about the explanatoriness of grounding. But if you go to the truth-making literature, a bit more has been said, actually. And I think that at least the sense of explanation that we're after, I think that thing is the same when it comes to grounding and truth-making, even if there may be other differences between the two. And I guess this is what Jessica would call a vertical undertaking, in the sense that I will stay in the grounding, squarely within the kind of grounding paradigm. But I want to do this because I think that when we want to criticize grounding or defend grounding, I think it's a good idea if we know what grounding is first. And I think that unless we know what metaphysical explanation is supposed to do, then we don't really know what grounding is. And I won't tell you. I won't tell you. I'll just tell you that we have to find out. That's basically the gist of this talk. I would also like to say that because I'm interested in grounding the idea rather than grounding Kit Fine's grounding or Jonathan Schaffer's grounding and so on, I'll try to stay clear of some of the details that inform these different accounts of grounding throughout, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so here's some kind of outline of this talk, and we'll see what I get through. I'm going to go through these one by one, but basically what I want to assume, and I will say a few words about that, is that grounding, if it exists, at least as an interesting thing, is an explanatory relation, and it's also an explanatory relation with a certain direction. Some would claim that the directional part is kind of baked into it being explanatory. We'll come back to that. And then I want to make a number of claims to show that this explanatoriness of grounding, although very little discussed, is nevertheless used in order to justify positing or using grounding. So that grounding is explanatory has been used as an argument for positing it. And this is because its being explanatory is a way of, has been said to be a way of distinguishing it from other similar metaphysical dependence relations. And this is basically why people think there's work for a theory of grounding. Of course, if nothing distinguished grounding from other kinds of metaphysical dependence, then there wouldn't be any work for grounding. But I think that the reason people think there is that, can you, oh yes, wow, is that, and people say this, and I have quotes, it's because grounding, unlike these other relations, is an explanatory relation. So it's what distinguishes grounding from these other relations. And also, rather than the other way around, it turns out many, perhaps most of the formal properties that people have attributed to grounding, even when they are not in agreement about what those formal properties are, the justification for claiming that grounding has this or that formal property is often said to be its explanatoryness. So grounding, as we shall see, so grounding is supposed to be asymmetrical because it's an explanatory relation, and explanations are asymmetrical, or it's supposed to be irreflexive because explanations are irreflexive, etc., etc. So it's being an explanatory relation has kind of substantial consequences for, its nature, what kind of thing we think grounding is. Yet, as it turns out, these truths that kind of operate in the background about what an explanation is in this circumstance turn out to be not without their problems of their own, especially if we consider the way grounding supposedly operates in comparison to other kinds of explanatory relations. So I will suggest that to come up with a reasonable account in view of the role that explanation plays for a theory of grounding, I think we'd better come up with a well-justified idea about, the sense in which grounding is supposed to be explanatory. And our options, I suggest, is that we either do this by, taking the sense in which grounding is explanatory and likening it to a sense in which something else is explanatory. So you can find different theories of explanation in the sciences. You can find theories of causal explanation, for instance. You could say things like well, grounding is explanatory in the same way as causality is explanatory, or grounding is explanatory in the same way as XYZ is explanatory. And then you emulate that theory. That's from Nolan. But should it turn out that grounding has, or that we have reason to believe that grounding, in order to stay like an interesting notion, has features that make it not suitable for being compared to these other kinds or other instances of explanation, then perhaps we might have to innovate. That is, we would have to then come up with a special theory for the kinds of explanations that we find in the grounding case that is different from other theories of explanation. And both of these come with their own problems, of course, as we shall see, or well, as I will say, and I will say it already now. If we innovate, this is because there is no theory of explanation to which grounding explanations can be likened. But this would, of course, mean that something would have to be done about our general notion of explanation, because we have to have some reason for calling grounding explanations, thereby claiming that they somehow resemble, for instance, causal explanations. But as we shall see, it may be that the kind of changes that we would have to make to our general notion of explanation are rather radical. Okay. So just a few words about the assumptions. And I know that all of these are, there are huge discussions behind this, but I'm just going to, this is the way, first of all, this will reflect the way I think about grounding, the way I find it an interesting relation in comparison to other kinds of relations you find out there. And also, I like this idea of grounding being the kind of structuring relation of reality. So I like this idea of grounding being something out there that kind of structures reality, not by us doing anything, but by being out there and, holding between things. So I'll assume that grounding is a relation. Not everyone agrees, but let's accept that for the moment. And by this I mean that it together with its relata belong to the universe, the ultimate furniture of the universe. It's out there, It's an objective thing, and it would ground whatever it does ground, irrespective of whether we were there to kind of observe it and talk about it and think about it. Also, I will try to stay neutral when it comes to the relata of grounding. So I will basically just talk as if grounding holds between any kind of worldly entities, including if truth-making is considered a kind of grounding propositions. Of course, some people have argued that grounding has to relate facts if it's a relation. Well, I don't want to get into that now. I don't find those reasons very compelling. Also, I will assume that there is this directedness and that what is grounded is always less fundamental than, whatever that means, what is grounding, doing the grounding. Let's see now. Okay, the assumption is also that grounding is an explanatory relation, so it's supposed to be explanatory. And here are some just a few quotes but of course you all know this, but just to show you that I'm not making this up. So here's, for instance, Trogdon. He says, in causal explanations, the explanans and the explanandum are connected through a causal mechanism, while in metaphysical explanations, they're connected through a constitutive form of determination, that of grounding. So here we have grounding as a relation that holds between explanandum and explanans. It's an explanatory relation. De Rosset says, on the view we are exploring, grounding explanations indicate grounding relations among entities and thereby give us insight into the nature of those entities. So here again, we have this idea of a relation that holds between entities and that indicates grounding explanation. I'll come back to that, whether grounding is an explanatory relation or whether it indicates explanation or whatever. And here we have Arianna Betti about truth-making, which we are now supposing is a kind of grounding. Truth-making is often construed as grounding. The truth of a particular statement is grounded in some entity in the world, playing the role of truth-maker for that statement. This easily leads one to think that truth-makers provide ontological explanations of the truths they are truth-makers of, that Socrates is pale, the proposition is true because there is a paleness trope in Socrates or some alternative entity playing the truth-making role. And here's some more. Trogdon, oh, do I have Trogdon twice? Yes, he was so important that he got to, no, feature, where am I? Yes. No, here we are. The core truth-maker commitment is in this respect that what we call the demand for ontological explanation, that is for ontological posits that would serve to explain, that is account in a non-epistemic way for the truth of propositions. Lots and lots of things that you don't understand in that quote. But of course, you know, they could indicate something that you understand, but you know, as stated, and I think this is in general, this is true. People are saying like enormous amounts of things about these explanatory relations, but it's not obvious where it's coming from. McFettridge says, talk of truth-making should have been seen as expressing the thought that for every sentence which is true, there must be some explanation of why it is true. And Chris Swire says, the word explain often figures explicitly in arguments for the existence of properties. But even when the word explain is absent, we often find claims that some phenomenon holds in virtue of or because of this or that property, that a property is the ground or foundation of some phenomenon, or that a property is, in part, the truth maker for a sentence describing the phenomenon. The role of such expressions is to give reasons to answer why questions, and this is the central point of explanation. But of course, note that the reasons that are given in these explanations are a property, for instance. So these are not the normal kinds of reasons that you find in normal explanations. But these are that property is a reason to accept this or that phenomenon. De Rosset again, the existence and features of all macroscopic concreta are fully explicable solely by reference to the existence and features of other things. Those other things are in this sense prior to the familiar macroscopic individuals. Ultimately, the explanation bottoms out in a relatively sparse inventory of entities whose existence and features have no further explanation. So note some things here that I find very interesting and I think possibly very fruitful. That we have here some kind of notion of explanation that speaks to a lot of philosophers, including me, and I think perhaps some of you. It doesn't sound weird to say that, you know, this phenomenon exists in virtue of those properties, for instance. But what people are talking about here generally is, you know, those properties, you know, that blackness, and, you know, as an explanation of the color of that chair, you know, so it seems like there's a relationship here between the properties that are there and the chair that is here, and that's an explanatory relation. And that's, once you start to try and understand how this relates to, you know, explanation, as explanation has been understood in the explanation literature, or theories of explanation, it's very hard to find something that kind of relates to this way of explaining. Okay, so I just want to make another assumption, and that is that so there are two ways, or perhaps three ways, in which the claim that grounding, the grounds of something explain that which is grounded by them. So either you can think about grounding as explanatory in the way causation is often taken to be explanatory. So although we say things like the throwing of the ball caused or explains the shattering of the window, if you look at theories of causal explanation, the causal relation never plays anything but a contributing role in explanation. So you need the relation, or the what do you call it? The covariance, or yeah, something like that. No, never mind. The relate. Yeah, well, anyway, but you also need laws, and you need those kinds of things in order to have an explanation. So more or less, whether or not you are in agreement with Hempel, I think most theories of causal explanation are variants of the Hempelian kind of explanation. So they're basically arguments where, you know, the obtaining of this relation, or this first comes this, then comes that, is just one part of the explanation, and it's far from enough to get the explanation. So, so grounding, just like causation, if you have this similar view for grounding, is thought then to be embedded in a network of notions, including that of law of necessity, of conditionals, and not least of that of explanation. Just like causation always takes place against the background of causal generalizations, grounding always takes place against the background of metaphysical generalizations somehow. So causation would then, or explanation, the explanatory part of grounding, or its explanatory feature, it would be explanatory in the sense that grounding could feature in these kinds of networks of things, and then we could distill explanation from that. There is another option, which I think is a bit more interesting, and it's that, and sometimes it sounds as if this is what, or very often I think it sounds as if this is what people are saying. It's that grounding is explanatory by nature. So here's Trogdon, for instance. The grounding fact and the metaphysical explanation facts are the same facts. In this case, grounding proper just is metaphysical explanation. And another way of putting this is that when people come up with examples, just as we can say the throwing of the ball explains the windows shattering, we can say this and make it sound as if what we're referring to is the explanatory relation. This is precisely how people talk about grounding. So I'm not saying that the fact that they talk this way, as if, you know, the explanatoriness is in the relation that holds between particular facts or particular objects in nature, necessarily means that we have to accept that grounding is explanatory by nature. But at least, you know, that's one of the options. And here's just something in between. Rodriguez Pereira says that explanation is not and does not account for grounding. On the contrary, grounding is what makes possible and grounds explanation. So here I'm not sure how to interpret this. So it doesn't sound as if it's kind of scientific explanation in this kind of traditional sense. It more sounds like we have two relations going on here. So one explanatory and one grounding relation. So I'm not sure what to say about that. So in favor of the contribution view, we could say that to know in what sense grounding is explanatory, we could examine theories explaining what sense causation is explanatory. And so that would be helpful. There's a lot of theories about that. But in favor of by nature, which is the way route I'm going to go down today, you could say that, as pointed out by Jessica, grounding is only interesting if there is any work for grounding to do. But, you know, and one of the reasons people have introduced grounding explicitly is because I'll come back to the example with supervenience, but very often they compare it to supervenience and say, well, it's very similar, but, you know, what we're lacking is this kind of productive or making or relevance that we find in grounding. So we don't only have like dependence. What we have is something like something else. We have explanation, and that's the difference. Of course, I think that every kind of metaphysical dependence relation can feature in a network such as that in which causation features, and in a sense contribute to explanation. So as soon as we find that there is metaphysical dependence of any kind, you know, we learn something. And so together with other things that we know, we will have something that can contribute to explanation. So, but if we want grounding to be different from not just one in the crowd of metaphysical dependence relations, it has to stand out. So that, I think, is a reason to try out the idea that grounding is explanatory by nature. Of course, this has some consequences, as we shall see. Okay, and so here's just many things that people say actually make it sound as if I'm right, that grounding is supposed to explain by nature. So Smith and Simon, for instance, say that the core truth-maker commitment is in this respect what we might call the demand for ontological explanation. That is, for ontological posits that would serve to explain account in a non-epistemic way for the truth of propositions of a given type. That certainly makes it sound as if the thingies are doing the explanation. So in what follows, it will be assumed that grounding, if it is explains this in an interesting way, explains by nature, or interesting. If it explains in a unique way, like if it's being an explanatory relation is something that makes it stand out, it does so by nature. Let's see what happens. Now, that grounding is explanatory has been taken as a reason for its existence. So here's Bigelow. Truth makers are entities whose raison d'être is to explain what makes a linguistic item true. And here's Audi. It is the fact that there are such grounding explanations, together with the fact that their correctness cannot be underwritten by a causal relation, that makes it incumbent upon us to recognize grounding. Okay, so that grounding as explanatory has also been taken as its distinguishing mark. And as I was mentioning, very common is that this is communicated by comparing grounding to supervenience. So here's David Liggins. Remember that the problem arose when considering necessities. That is the problem that if truth-making is mere supervenience, then necessary truths are made true by anything. On McFetridge's approach, the claim that truths have truth makers is cashed out as a request to explain why true sentences are true. And it is clearly not the case that we can explain why the Goldbach conjecture is true if it is by talking about refrigerators. We need to talk about the entities invoked by whatever is the right semantics for mathematical discourse. So here we have this idea that if the grounds explain what they ground, then this adds something substantial, something hyper-intentional to the mix, making us like not able to kind of find all the relevant relations just by looking at the modalities. You have to look at something else. Okay, and Rodriguez Pereira, thus what is fundamental in the idea of truth-making is not supervenience, but the idea that truths are true in virtue of entities. That truth supervenes on being is a consequence of the fact that truths are true in virtue of entities, and this is why the supervenience of truth on being is important, but the supervenience of being on truth is not. And Kim, supervenience itself is not an explanatory relation. It is not a deep metaphysical relation. Rather, it is a surface relation that reports a pattern of property covariation, suggesting the presence of an interesting dependency relation that might explain it. So there is this idea that there are these dependence relations, and supervenience is admittedly, you know, the most common example, but I'm sure you could find more if you started looking. And that the reason, what makes grounding different from these is that it is an explanatory relation. So explanation plays a very important role here in our understanding of grounding. And finally, that grounding is explanatory is supposed to give us its formal properties. And the interesting part about this is that when talking to different people, basically, if you look at different papers, it seems to give them different formal properties. So, which again, I think tells us that, you know, our notion of explanation is perhaps not as well defined as we sometimes talk as if it is. So, but normally the most common view is that I say asymmetric, you said anti-symmetric. Does that? Well, I can go with asymmetric for now anyway, so let's do that. So the most common view that I find in the literature is that it's reflexive, asymmetric, and transitive because it's this kind of partial ordering relation. Or strict partial ordering, yes. But you can find explicitly in the literature like justification for those very formal properties from what is taken to be the properties of explanation. So I think Trogdon's introduction to grounding is an excellent example. The whole paper is just full of, hints about how things are this or that way, because explanation obviously is that way. And in fact, I think when you look through the literature, you very often find justifications of different claims about grounding that have the form of, grounding is this way or grounding is that way, because obviously explanation is this or that way. But interestingly enough, of course, people have different views about what's obviously true about explanation. So for instance, irreflexive, because explanation is irreflexive, grounding is irreflexive. Asymmetric, because explanation is asymmetric, grounding is asymmetric. Transitive must be a problem for people who think that we should kind of inherit the properties of grounding from the properties of explanation, because I don't think that on many views of explanation is explanation transitive, and I'll come back to that. It has to do with the role understanding is often supposed to play for explanation. But interesting manuscript, I didn't have the time to say much. I don't know if it's out yet, but Rodriguez Pereira has an argument against all of these. He says that grounding has none of these properties, actually. Is it out now?
Yeah, it's the new American Philosophical Association journal.
Okay. Check it out. Okay. But the problem with, if you take these formal properties that obviously belong to explanation, therefore to grounding, is that all of them can be at least discussed. So take the property of being irreflexive. I mean, to say that grounding is irreflexive is possibly problematic if taken in combination with some idea about the well-foundedness of explanation and grounding, and some idea about everything needing an explanation. So if you have those views, then it seems like, the fundamentals would also need some kind of explanation. But if, explanation has to come to an end, it seems likely that, explanation, some things are self-explanatory. And in fact, if you look at the literature on explanation, or in the history of philosophy, you find all sorts of things that are self-explanatory, like Cartesian ideas and unmoved movers. I'm not sure. Well, it depends on what you mean by explanation, of course, but it's not like there is a rule saying that nothing can explain itself. So I don't think it's part of our general idea of explanation that it has to be irreflexive. Still, that has been used as a reason to say that grounding is irreflexive. And take asymmetry. Of course, if irreflexivity is under fire, then so is asymmetry. But you could also think about the relation between parts and wholes, which is possibly, maybe, a kind of grounding, where obviously people seem to think that maybe not the same people, but some people think that there is grounding going from parts to wholes, and others to think that it's going from wholes to parts. And what's to prevent it going both ways? I mean, why couldn't it go both ways? I don't know. I'm just saying that our notion of explanation is not, it's not set in stone. We don't really know what we're talking about when we're talking about explanation. And when we come to transitivity, I think it's even worse, because our notion of explanation is very, very firmly tied to ideas about increase in understanding. Again, not very well spelled out, but there is this idea that if A explains B, then by getting to know A, I understand B more. But of course, understanding doesn't really necessarily sit well with transitivity, because understanding involves human minds that are fallible and, might go for this or that. I have to hurry up a little bit. So we have to make some choices. Let's see if we can find out what kind of explanation that underlies this idea of grounding as a relation in re, so to speak. And I think we need to make a lot of choices. Here are some of the choices you might want to make if we look at the literature on explanation. We need to understand we need to decide if the explanation involved in grounding is realist or epistemic, if it involves the act of explaining or not, if the sense in which the explanation explains is the same as the sense in which some other things explain, and if this is a sense for which we have a previously developed theory or not. So whether there is a theory of explanation on which we could emulate grounding explanations, and so on. So realist or epistemic? Well, I think we would have to say that it is realist, at least given how I've set things up. So an epistemic explanation is such that the posited entities need not really exist, but they should be useful for organizing human experience and the results of scientific experiments. For instance, by helping us make predications. Well, actually, this is how most of the scientific explanatory theories are set up. So, but seems unlikely that this is the way in which grounding explanation is supposed to explain. Are grounding explanations such that they essentially involve the act of explaining or not? So according to Lewis, you can regard an explanation either as the act of explaining or a chunk of explanatory information, very nicely put. And even if an explanation is realist, you could have the idea that it essentially involved the act of explaining. But again, I think it's unlikely that this is how grounding explanations are supposed to work. So grounding is supposed to be kind of the world's own structuring tool. So the explanations are supposed to be there, whether or not we act on them or utter the explanations or not. So I think it's likely to say that it's not a kind of explanation that essentially involves the act of explaining. Okay, skip there. And of course, this has consequences for understanding. So as we saw, transitivity could be in trouble if understanding was essentially involved in explaining and so in grounding. But if it's not, I think transitivity might be safe. But again, the price, of course, is that we are taking a huge step away from almost all well thought out theories of explanation, where understanding is playing a crucial role. So, is it Daly? I thought it was Nolan who had this distinction. Okay. So Daly has proposed that there are two ways in which we might distinguish, two ways you might go if you want to understand the way in which metaphysical explanation or grounding explanations are explanatory. The way of innovation and the way of emulation. So the way of innovation, slightly revised, is this. Grounding explanations are unlike all other kinds of explanation, at least for which we have reasonably developed theories. Therefore, to find out in what sense grounding is explanatory, we need to formulate a new theory of explanation for those kinds of explanations, and to add them to the mix. So we will have discovered a new way of explaining. And the way of emulation says that grounding explanations are sufficiently like some other kinds of explanation. Therefore, to find out in what sense grounding is explanatory is to find out which account of the nature of explanation best applies to grounding, and then see what it has to say about what it means to say that X explains Y in the grounding sense. Now, a problem for the way, there are many problems for the way of innovation. First of all, it's very hard to come up with a new theory of explanation. But most importantly, it becomes a bit unclear in what sense we have the right to say that grounding is an explanatory relation. So note that to say that it is supposed to mark it out as different, and importantly different, from other kinds of dependence relations. But it's also supposed to appeal to something in us. So by saying this, we get all these ideas, as we have seen already. By finding out that grounding is an explanatory relation, people think that they can find out what formal features that grounding has, how it relates to other things, other notions out there, and so on and so forth. But of course, if it turns out that the way in which grounding is explanatory is radically different from the way in which other things are supposed to be explanatory, then first of all, perhaps it confuses more than it helps to call it explanatory, because it kind of evokes these ideas that we have about other kinds of explanation, and perhaps it kind of just muddles the waters completely. Here's Daly. He says, the metaphysician is left to his or her own devices. In this case, he or she cannot appeal to instances of the same type of putative explanation, which his opponent might antecedently be more willing to concede are genuine cases of explanation. To that extent, it may not be apparent that what the metaphysician offers are genuine explanations, and so the task of showing that they are explanatory is correspondingly difficult. So if we go innovative, this will probably have, given that this new kind of explanation is also a kind of explanation, we would have to rethink our notion of explanation generally, and perhaps that would have two radical consequences. Oh, and here's a problem for the way of emulation, given how I've set things up, of course. So I think we have reason to believe that if there is grounding, and if grounding is an interesting relation, then it is an objective relation that exists independently of the act of explaining, and that is explanatory independently of the act of explaining. It provides kind of non-causal explanations, but not in any of the senses that you can find by looking in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, at least. So there you can find explanation that refers to mathematical relations. You can find other kinds of non-causal explanation. But this is kind of a kind of explanation, as Al said, that looks much more like causal explanation, only it's non-causal explanation. It can explain by features had by the explanatory relation itself rather than by something to which the relation belongs as one part, which, if I'm right about this, although it looks very much like causal explanation, it is not like causal explanation, because causal explanations are explanations where the relation explains in virtue of contributing to a larger whole of things. So it's hard to see, and this is very, weak, but it's like prima facie hard to see what well-developed account of explanation of the grounding type could possibly emulate. So where do we go from here? We could give up. Let's see. So if there is no theory of explanation that our theory of grounding can emulate, we ought to give up and stop calling grounding explanatory. And perhaps this means actually that there is no work for a theory of grounding, because if I'm right to think that what could possibly mean that there is work for a theory of grounding is if we could find this feature that makes it special. And I think it's the explanatoriness. And I'm not saying that there has to be one relation that is like that. It could be a subset of all the metaphysical dependence relations that you mentioned, for instance. I don't think all of them would kind of qualify as explanatory, whatever explanatory turns out to mean. Or we could carry on. If there is no theory of explanation that our theory of grounding can emulate, we ought to go down the road of innovation after all. And so here are some very, very weakly thought out reasons for innovating in spite of the difficulties. Now, first of all, I think that grounding is at least prima facie a useful notion. And I must say that although I disagree with a lot of the literature today, which kind of makes it sound as if grounding was invented, like, I don't know how many years ago now, but not that many. I think that, for me at least, Jonathan Schaffer's text on what grounds what, I think was a very good way of kind of summarizing and like giving us a framework in which to talk about what had been going on for a long time. And I think that way, also to talk in terms of grounding and in terms of dependencies and in terms of hierarchical structuring, I think is very helpful for the kind of serious metaphysician doing hardcore metaphysics. Very good way of kind of explaining what it is that we're trying to do. So it would be nice if we could keep it. And it certainly feels right. I'm a woman, after all. I have to have these feeling arguments. It certainly feels right to me to say that we account for the truth of truths with reference to that which makes them true, or that something exists in virtue of something else more fundamental. And these are all explanatory locutions. At least that far we can. And now we come to what I think is the most interesting thing that I was supposed to start thinking more about. So I have this sneaking suspicion that grounding explanations, as I've set them out here, like explanations that are objective, that are relation, where explanation resides in the relation itself, and that are not essentially involving the act of explaining, and so on and so forth. Perhaps these are a kind of explanation that are not only found in metaphysics. Perhaps they are kind of ubiquitous. Maybe they are kind of a lot of them in the sciences too. So if you start looking, and in fact, sometimes they're even formulated in explanatory terms, but nobody has really kind of reflected over the fact that they are there. And I've tried to actually, I tried to get some people together from different fields to talk about this. So I had some examples from, I don't know what the word is in English, the science of fish. There is a term for that, but where they explained, you know, stuff about the nature of the fish with reference to its kind of how it was, how the bone structure was kind of a constitutive explanation. It sounded like something very similar to a grounding explanation. I had people from doing working in kind of philosophy of science, but also medicine, working with certain types of diagnosis that are behavioral diagnosis, like, or I don't know what the word is in English, but so take a diagnosis like ADHD, for instance, that is kind of, so the explanation is kind of is constitutive, it's terms of constitutive behavior, but it's, yeah, so it's not, there were at least similarities there, and I think there is more as soon as we start looking. And I don't know what to say about explanations of water in terms of, by saying it's H2O, those kinds of things. Perhaps they are also kind of species of this kind. So should that turn out to be true, that you can find these, that there are these explanations, that people use explanatory locutions when putting them forward, and should it turn out that they're actually more like grounding explanations than they are like most of the explanations for which we have, you know, theories of scientific explanation, then I think going down the road of innovation would perhaps be very important, because then I think we have some justification for doing that in spite of the possibly radical consequences it could have for our general notion of explanation. Yes, thank you.